thank you. It's so nice to be here and in person. Can you hear me or do I need to? We're good. We're good. I'm going to put this right here. So I would say for my experience with COVID the past year and a half, it's been like living in a constant law school exam. Constant. And so what I thought I would just kind of quickly do is walk you through some of the laws that we have seen, some of the laws that we see coming maybe, but just high level and very quickly. When we first went into what I would call lockdown, a lot of the calls I was getting was to have an essential provider letter. I had never heard of such. And so, for our folks that were essential providers, they wanted to have a letter in their car in case they were stopped, because we really didn't know what our, quote, lockdown was going to look like. So then we quickly turned to the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which required some paid sick leave and some paid emergency expanded FMLA leave. Had lots of questions about that. Department of Labor flip-flopped on its regulations. I mean, it was one of those, I was printing out the DOL suggested guidelines when I was giving advice because I just truly didn't know. That mandatory leave expired at the end of December. It was extended for voluntary leave and the tax credits associated with that. I'm not a tax lawyer, so I would immediately defer that to someone else in my office. But that all expired at the end of September. We were starting to see worker comp cases coming through about COVID exposures. I'm sure you can touch on that. Those are still kind of working their way through the Workers' Comp Commission. In June, OSHA issued an emergency temporary standard for healthcare workers. At that point, there were a lot of exceptions to that standard. And so for the folks that it really applied to, they were like, this is old news, we're already doing this. And so that really wasn't that big of a deal. Then you get in the masking policy. We've had CDC say unvaccinated must wear a mask. If you're vaccinated, originally it was you don't have to wear a mask. Now it is if you're in an area of high or substantial transmission, you should be wearing a mask. I checked today, state of Mississippi is entirely a substantial community transmission. Yep. And so now the big conversation is about vaccinations, whether those should be mandatory or not. When we first started, all the vaccines that were coming out were under an emergency use authorization by the FDA. As a lawyer, I had some concerns about trying to implement a mandatory policy when you are under this emergency use authorization and supposed to be taking it voluntary.
Right.
So we didn't really see that. Now what we're in for the ones that went ahead and our clients that wanted to have a mandatory policy, you still have to have exemptions for those that are medically not able to take the vaccine because of an underlying health condition or a religious exemption. So those have all been floating around. What we have been very busy with over the past month is the vaccine mandates that have come from the federal government. And so we've seen those for federal employees, we've seen it for federal contractors. And that's a lot of questions I'm getting. November 4th, we had new rules issued by CMS, the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services, having a mandatory vaccination policy with the first shot needs to be in arms by December 6th, second by January 4th, and it requires written policies. The only exemptions would be for ADA or Title VII. And then on the same day, OSHA put out its emergency temporary standard for employers with more than 100 employees. We talk a lot about OSHA. I think a lot of employers or people just kind of say, I don't deal with blood, right, so I don't need to worry about OSHA. I don't deal with chemicals. I don't need to worry about OSHA. But all employers have a duty to provide a reasonable, safe environment for their workers. And that includes trying to limit or remove known hazards. So we have this new rule from OSHA. It is either be vaccinated or submit to weekly testing. And then We are looking at challenges. So all of the federal contractors, CMS, and the OSHA are being challenged in the courts. The OSHA one to me is probably the one that I don't see standing up, and I defer to y'all. We have seen in the history of OSHA, their emergency temporary standards just don't get upheld that often. So what we saw were an influx of cases all over the country to different circuits. And so the Fifth Circuit, which sits for Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, was speedy right out of the gate. The challenge was filed, I think, on a Friday, and on a Saturday morning they issued a temporary restraining order with a really tight briefing schedule. And then last week came out with a really scathing opinion, striking down the ETS. But from a legal perspective, Fifth Circuit might have jumped the gun, because when you have all these different lawsuits that are filed, it needs to go to multi-district litigation, and there's procedures as to how that litigation would then work. And so that got filed yesterday. And then there's what they call a ping pong lottery. Like the clerk literally writes the circuits on a ping pong that have cases pending before it, puts it in a drum, and then draws. And so the Sixth Circuit actually drew the ping pong. And so Sixth Circuit is for Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, and Michigan. And they can either say, yep, Fifth Circuit, you did it right, rubber stamp it and be done, or they can totally flip-flop. So I defer to y'all as to what do we do now.
That's great. That was such a good, articulate rundown of everything that we also have been living with since COVID came out. So I work for an insurance company, and we do both commercial, which is like, for any of you that don't know what commercial insurance is, that's your work comp, your general liability. It's the thing you're going to look to. If somebody comes on your property and they get hurt, or one of your employees gets hurt, you're looking at your commercial insurance, okay? And then you have group benefits. So those are your employees. If they need to go to the doctor, this is their insurance card, right? So we're all familiar with that. Now I'm going to throw some other terms at you: exposure and liability. And so those were two of the places, because they exist on both sides of the house, what we call the benefits and the commercial insurance side. And when COVID hit, it was like this monster storm of both of these things that businesses need to be concerned about. Because what do you do as a business that is funding your group benefit plan if you have a lot of employees that get very, 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 very sick? And COVID claims cost a lot of money, and somebody's got to pay for those. So what do you do as an employer if you're trying to control that cost? Because most of the time, employers, that's what they're looking at most of the time, is that bottom line. How do we control that cost? Because if we have what I'll call leaky like funding, where it's just we're paying claims, guess what's going to happen at renewal? We're going to get a big, nasty hike, right? And then if we want to continue to be generous with our benefit policies, we're going to have to, at some point, pass that cost on to the employee. Usually we're going to see higher deductibles, we're going to see higher copay, something like that is going to have to happen, because the money has to come from somewhere, and the employer cannot just continue to eat that cost. And on the flip side of that as well, when you're talking about employee benefits, you're also talking about leave time. So once these paid provisions that were mandated by the government were gone, what are we going to do when we have people who we're trying to make sure they stay healthy? We want them to stay home, but we also want them to come to work. What are we going to do? On the commercial side, if you have an employee that was directly exposed in the workplace, that's where this term of work comp liability comes into play, because you are exposed. And so this is why you saw a lot of businesses cracking down and saying, if you don't feel good, if you were at all exposed, please do not come to work, because all of a sudden when they come on your property, that's your problem as an employer. Not to say that your people are problems, but it is a problem that you need to deal with, okay? They're problems, yeah. So where it gets complicated is this tension that we see in complying with what the federal government says that we need to be doing. And OSHA, Jennifer said the four-letter word, OSHA. OSHA is something that we all need to be concerned about, because they could show up at your door any day, and that's something none of you want, because I would be willing to bet that all of you have enough to do in your day-to-day that dealing with a governmental organization going, I want to see how safe your organization is, and show me how many people got sick, because OSHA does have rules that if you have a person that gets hospitalized, and how many of us know somebody who was put in the hospital with COVID? A lot of us could probably say yes to that. So if that happened at work, now all of a sudden, not only are you dealing with the medical claims of that person if they're on your insurance, if they're a dependent and they're on your insurance, that's also something you're worried about. You're looking at rising costs, but you're also looking at having to call OSHA if they've been hospitalized, because OSHA says that if you have an individual, an employee that was hospitalized, you have to notify them within 24 hours of finding out about it. So all of us now should know these words. You didn't know that. If they die, you have 8 hours. So not to go dark and morbid, but that's real. I just go there fast. So you got 8 hours if you have an employee that you've had a fatality and it is connected to a workplace exposure. That's the key. But how many of us can actually know where any of us were exposed if we were exposed, which is why businesses are panicking. Because if you have employees that have gone out on their weekend and have had their fun weekend, the holidays are coming up. You've got employees that are going to get together with family. Those families work for different organizations. Those families are going out living their lives. They've got kids that are in school. They're bringing something. What if that employee, because we know that there's like a 14-day period where you could be fine, day 13, you get sick. Well, now all of a sudden, think through the last 48 hours of your life. Who were you around? Were you within 6 feet of them? Probably. Doesn't matter if you wore a mask or not. It's been a close contact, and so now we got to quarantine people. You see quickly how this grows out of hand. And I wanted to preface everything that I said by that so that we can understand why this matters and why we need to pay attention to it. Because regardless of what OSHA, whether the Sixth Circuit comes out and said, yes, OSHA does have the jurisdiction and authority to say, because ultimately, if you look at the OSHA Act, I would encourage every single one of you to look at it. They have the authority to say how to keep your people safe. They're the gurus on that. And if you read the ETS through, it says time and time again that they recognize COVID as a grave danger to your employees. I listened to the area director for the Louisiana division of OSHA. I'm sure I'm not using the right words, but anyway, the lady, she's in charge for that area. She tells all the people, like, hey, and they listen to her. They don't want to upset her. So I heard her speak once upon a time, this is several years ago, that she had looked at the fatalities because that's what OSHA is ultimately trying to prevent. They want people to go home in the same condition or better than they came to work that morning. And if they don't, they want to know about it so they can go in and fix it. And oftentimes the organizations that do directly deal with OSHA, industries that have manufacturing, they deal with heavy equipment, the danger is pretty high. You know, they want their people also to come in and go home in the same order, same condition that they came in. But OSHA's interest is making sure they're keeping people safe. And they've gotten a bad rap because people don't like paying fines, and they will fine you and penalize you for a lot of things that you didn't even know were an exposure. But when this area director looked at their fatalities in this year, they had 37 fatalities for the year. And she thought, we're doing better because the numbers had gone down, right? That's the goal. But then she stopped for a moment and she looked at the number of fatalities and she said, that's 37 people that will never go home again. That's a mom, that's a dad, that's somebody's kid, that's somebody's best friend. That is an employee that was hired to do that job that will never be able to show up and do that job. What a loss. 37 is not good enough. So OSHA has a very high standard with what they're looking at, and ultimately their job is to empower employers to keep their workplace free of all known hazards. So can we all agree that we look at COVID as a known hazard?
Yes.
You don't want it in your organization, and so everything that you're seeing and every policy that is recommended that you implement, because we work a lot with helping employers figure out what kind of policy do they need to have in writing, because if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. What do they need to have in place to equip their employees to make sure that all of these things that I just told you about, that all ultimately direct to your exposure and your liability as an employer, what are those things that they need to be saying? And sometimes you're going to look like the bad guy. It's going to mean that you're going to have to tell a bunch of people to put a mask on their face and not come to work. And maybe because we have suffered significant cost, because we've had a lot of people who got really sick and our medical claims are really high, maybe we had a bunch of people that did get sick, and so we're looking at work comp liability and exposure, and those premiums are going up. And so we can't afford to pay people not to come to work, because that is a conversation that a lot of businesses are having to have. So what do? sometimes you got to take the high road and decide it is more valuable to us to keep our people safe. Should always be your number one goal, is to keep your people safe so that you don't have to call an attorney to defend you in court because you didn't do the things that you needed to do. So what comes next from an insurance standpoint, I would tell you, you need to have policies in place that outline all this. Regardless of what happens with this emergency temporary standard with OSHA, you need to be preparing right now. You need to be drafting some type of language that is saying, you know, if you're sick, don't come to work. If you feel like mandated vaccinations are a route that you need to go, which is an individual conversation, you need to look at your workforce, how many people have actually had it. You need to be understanding what is an Americans with Disabilities Act exemption. What is a seriously held religious belief? What is a medical exemption? Because a lot of people, I talk to them every single day, my two coworkers on my team, they talk to people every single day that they have never heard the words ADA before, and they don't know what exemption, what is this thing? You need to familiarize yourself with this stuff, and the information is out there, freely consumable to everybody. All you got to do is Google seriously held religious exemption, and I promise you Google's not going to let you down. Now, what I would also urge you not to do is to look at like threads of like regular Joe Schmo telling you what they think about seriously held religious beliefs or medical exemptions. I would go to, usually what you're going to see is some law firms that have written some really well thought out blog posts and articles. Jennifer's name might come up in some of those. But read about those and familiarize yourself with what does that mean and what does that mean for your people. I would also encourage you to get busy with it now. Like, don't wait. When the ETS came out, it said employers had 60 days. Well, guess what's happening? Time is winding down, and that 60-day deadline does not move if the Sixth Circuit says it's a go. OSHA can say this. So that means you have even less time. So if you work with somebody, if this is not something that you directly touch, I would encourage you to reach out to the person in your office that does. It's usually a human resource professional, your safety manager, one of those. I'll be happy to give you my information and, you know, give you a couple little bullet points on where to go. You can ask me any questions that you want, but get going on this now and encourage them to. I mean, do not sit on this, because regardless of what happens, COVID is here. One final thing that I'll say, you know, there's a thing called an experience modification factor that also you do not want to creep up. And it can have major impacts on what you pay for your work comp premium. And that means that the more people that are getting sick and injured on your work site, including COVID, it's going to have an impact on that. So you have a vested interest, every single one of you, because even though you may not be making these decisions, you work for a company that is absorbing these costs. So the question you need to ask yourself is, do I want to eventually have to pay out of pocket through either more expensive health insurance premiums or in other ways that we get benefits cut because our company is trying to keep the doors open, because we have to legally have certain coverages in place in order to even open our door and allow people to come to work. So that's a lot that I've just laid on you. I said a bunch of insurance words. And so if you have any questions about what I've said, I welcome, you know, any of those questions. But that's what I would, you know, now what is the time, get to work and figure out what these policies need to say and get them out to your staff. Doesn't mean, I'm not telling you to do a mandatory anything, but other than our obligation as an employer is to keep you safe. Right. And that should be the language that you lead with, no matter what type of industry you work in. Sarah, take it away.
Well, I won't spend a whole lot of time talking about what happened for 18 months. It was a crazy, chaotic world. When in March of 2020, when the pandemic originally, you know, got, I guess for everybody, lack of layman's terms, bad, and everything bad was happening. I was in the healthcare industry in an acute care setting here in Jackson at Methodist Rehab. So while our patient census was small in nature, we only had about 85 beds that we could fill at any time. If you're not familiar with Methodist Rehab, they're a stroke, brain injury, and spinal cord injury rehabilitation hospital next to UMC. The main thing that we struggled with at that time was staffing. Our workers and nurses and healthcare technicians were considered essential workers. Mm-hmm. The very first phone calls we got were, what kind of letter do I need to put in my glove box for when I come to night shift tonight? I don't know. I didn't go to school to do this. I don't know the answer. Let me call you back. And so those were kind of the first freak out type moments for our employees. And within about 72 hours, we, of course, had legal counsel get involved and kind of help us transition through that. The staffing issue remained an immediate bleeding spot for us because we had a number of employees who had children who were in school. And they could not go to school. The remote learning thing was taking off. How am I supposed to be at work? I don't have childcare for my school-age child that cannot stay home by themselves. That was an enormous hurdle and obstacle to work through. And to be quite honest, I don't know how we did it, but we managed. No. We actually had a lot of our more mature employees step up and volunteer. We had some incentivized pay arrangements. Obviously, money talks when it comes to things like that. But really, we had a camaraderie around our employee base to do the right thing and to do as much as they could to help out. And that is a testament to someone's character. That is not something that you don't get taught how to be a good person. You learn those things from your surroundings and the way you were brought up and those who influence your life. And fortunately, we had a great group of employees. I did not envy our next door neighbors at UMC with over 9,000 employees to try to mitigate. Luckily, we had a small group of about 350. And from there, I transitioned back into the professional services world recently. And we do business with several states who have decided to go ahead and implement their vaccine mandate. And so similar to what Jennifer was saying earlier about, and Kelly too, you just kind of have to be on ready. We are actually already past ready. With a core group of our employees. We have about 150 people working on projects in North Carolina and the state of New York. And both of those states decided to not wait on OSHA due to the nature of their work and the nature of the contractual agreement that we have with them. We were forced to go ahead and implement our vaccine mandate or weekly testing about 60 days ago. And so both of those states, luckily, have been very gracious with us in learning the process behind this. There's an entire sub-world of how to report on these things. So how do I tell the state of New York and the state of North Carolina that our people are complying? How do I upload their test results for those that have chosen not to get vaccinated? All of those things go into the daily operations for this type of mandate. Mm-hmm. And so those two states actually built their own portal out for us to report into. It was proprietary software that they built on their own. So depending on what the future of this world looks like, I think we're going to see an increased amount of how do I even comply? Right. How do I even tell somebody that my employees are doing what you said they need to do? I don't know how to do that either. So luckily the state of New York and the state of North Carolina helped us out on that. But back in the professional services world, aside from healthcare, we sent a lot of our employees home. Over 75% of our employees became remote workers, even for our local office, our big, beautiful office that's out off Highland Colony Parkway that we had just finished and had just moved into and had just started paying a lease on. And then we had no one to show up into our big, beautiful new office. Elizabeth Ford, I keep mentioning and pointing towards her. She is one of my coworkers at Horn and in a tight leadership group in one of our practice groups. And so she can attest to how chaotic things were at that time prior to my rejoining the firm. One of the biggest issues that we continue to see with our remote workforce, even though a lot of us are back in the office, we still have a lot of contingent workers that are remote, is how to manage their performance. Mm-hmm. And I'll get so granular as to we had to make policies. We had to create policies around Zoom meetings and the fact that you have to have your camera on so that we can see you, so that we know Sarah is actually at work today and doing the things that she said she's going to be doing, and she hasn't put a proxy in her place. I didn't know how to do that either. So there's a lot we didn't know how to do, but we just, with the right counsel and the right mentors involved, you just kind of have to figure it out. Managing performance continues to be the biggest hurdle that we have. Meeting our clients' needs and exceeding their expectations continues to be a hurdle. It's not an easy thing to do by any means, but luckily we've got great leaders in place to help us try to manage those teams appropriately. On the flip side of that, we were really able to pivot quickly into hiring a lot of remote employees. I would tell you that 3 years ago, our firm and its partners probably never would have considered having over 850 remote employees. We have an entire team serving the state of California's COVID rent relief program right now, with over 600 employees that all work remotely in California. So Horn was really lucky to win that contract. If I'm not supposed to say that, sorry, Horn, but it's no secret. Those are public records. But never in 24 months ago would we have envisioned having 600 people living in California and working for us. That is just not something that we would have ever envisioned could happen for us. From a revenue standpoint, it's great. From a logistics standpoint, it's a nightmare. So we have been able to jump on some projects and win some work that we otherwise probably would never have bid on, just because we have that remote and contingent workforce available at our fingertips now. Problems come with that, yes, but problems are going to arise no matter the type of worker that you have, or no matter the type of issue with your client that you may have. You're always going to struggle to do better, more, and be there for your employees. We have a number of employees who are scared about losing their job. I would say probably 50% of the issues that I deal with on a weekly basis are concerned employees about what's going to happen next. And when you don't have an answer to tell them, it's kind of like when you have a sick or a loved one that's sick or in the hospital and the doctor can't tell you exactly what's going to happen to them. You live in that limbo world, and that is what a lot of HR professionals are doing right now, is living in that limbo world where I cannot tell you if you're going to have to get, vaccinated or do a weekly test. I cannot tell you if we're going to continue to have this contract based on, what might happen. So that's tough, for your HR people that you work with and your leadership. Those are some continued trials that they are going through. But at the end of the day, it is our job to provide a safe workplace for our employees, and we will comply with whatever we have to comply to from a legal standpoint. Our firm assumes a lot of risk. We have a big appetite for risk when we need to, but not when it comes to the health and safety of our employees and our clients.
Yeah, another thing I wanted to add that you were talking about is just this uncertainty. And a lot of the conversations that we've had with our clients over this period, this COVID period, have been people that are trying to plan out so far in the future. Let's say they have an employee that got long COVID, and there's some reasonable accommodation with this employee's health, and maybe they're fatigued easily, and so they're not able to work the normal number of hours. Maybe their performance did suffer. And so these are, things that every HR professional needs to have queued up on their radar, that if you have an employee whose performance is declining, you need to have a conversation with the employee and try to figure out what's going on. That, I would say, is the number one question that we ask back to clients when they call us and they tell us a situation that's happening. We say, well, have you talked to the employee? Yeah. No. Why don't you talk to the employee? Ask them what's going on. I mean, people have gotten kind of scared and gun shy to even ask questions, but if they are your employee and their performance is suffering, you do have a right to find out, what's going on within reason. I mean, we're not trying to get into the nitty-gritty details and play doctor, but we do need to figure out what's going on so that we can figure out, is there a way that we can accommodate this employee to keep them employed? So the job of HR professionals and every employer is to keep your people safe and keep your people employed if you can. So you need to lead with that. But for every person that has called with that employee that is sick and is not able to perform at the regular rate that they're used to performing, they want to know 6 months in the future, okay, we're going to offer them FMLA. Okay, when they come back from FMLA, we're going to do ADA, and then what? Why don't you just get through the next 12 weeks? Just get through the next 12 weeks, because really that is all that right now you have, which, if you're not familiar, Family Medical Leave Act, if you work for a larger employer that has 50 or more employees, and there's some little caveats there, 12 weeks of unpaid protected job and benefits leave, okay? So just go out that 12 weeks. Just take a deep breath and know we're not going to be able to look into a magic 8 ball and go, what happens next? We just can't. We can't. And I hope that that's a little bit of a reassurance hearing from, because I think that both Sarah and Jennifer would echo that same sentiment. There's just only so much that any of us can know. A lot of this is very unknown. So just sit in that. There's a word we were talking about earlier today called stoicism, which is just accepting the situation where you are right now. And that's what all of us should do. So that's a little 10-cent advice for today, is just sit in the stoicism and just don't expect it to be any different than it is, because it is where we are. As Jennifer mentioned, Mississippi cases are on the rise. Saw some stuff in Austria. They've gone back into lockdown if you're unvaccinated. Cases in Europe are exploding. So we can get ready for that and just know that that's where we are, and I'll do our part to keep everybody around us safe and keep ourselves safe.
The only thing I would add is also when you're looking at employees and judging them based on performance, what creative solutions have you come up with? Or are there any policies or procedures that you could adopt that would help in that situation? Say, for example, I am judged based on my billable hours and the dollars I bring in. Well, what happened when we went and shut down, locked down, and I was trying to homeschool my 2 kids? And I'm a terrible teacher. I was told multiple times. But, there's only so many hours in a day, and here I am trying to educate my child, and I'm seeing my hours go down. And so one of the things our firm did was adopt a policy, a child care and a child education policy, to put some billable hours back on my plate while I was spending time with my children. That, to me, I love Baker Donaldson. How great is it they would go ahead and put some money where their mouth is about, we really want you here. We really want to support you through this crazy, unprecedented time. Right. So think about some creative ways that you can support your employees, because the buy-in you will get, and it leads to employee retention, which I think we all have suffered with and are concerned about.
Yeah. For the most part, I think that if you as an employer lead with that attitude of what can we do for our employees, there's this mindset that I think if you've been burned once or twice as an employer for doing the generous thing, that you think that all of your employees are out to get you. But the reality is that the majority probably are there for you. And I'd be willing to bet on that any day. It feels, there's something called the vocal minority, that the loudest voice feels like there's a lot more of them than there actually are. And so I think that even though you are burned, don't draft your policy. Sure, use that as your boundary line to help put some parameters in place to keep you safe. But sit from a standpoint of the majority of our employees are good employees that are here for the benefit of our organization. If they are not, they'll probably play itself out. But if you draft policies with that mindset, eventually your workforce, you will start to see a turn in your culture and who you are retaining and who is staying and who's going. But, we just, for every conversation of, I just think all my employees are here to they're just running the clock, and they're not, and you can tell they've been burned a couple of times. But don't draft policies with that in mind. Really have that very generous spirit, because it will come back to you. I'm a firm believer in that what you put out there, good will come back to you every single time. You're going to get a little bad too, but the majority will come back dividends on the positive end.
I'd love to open up for questions if y'all have anything specific you'd like to ask. Anybody?
I was wondering, your employees that are getting the weekly testing, what does that look like? Does a firm come there?
Yeah, so one of the states in particular has put a parameter about the type of test. It has to be a certain type of test. There is not a designated provider that they are using per se, because they do have workers spread across several counties in New York and in North Carolina. But it can't just be, they've prohibited the at-home test. So like the Walgreens, and so they can't use that type of test. It has to be a certain, from a certain type of provider, and it has to be a certain test. Very similar to the way the ETS is written, if it ends
Who's
up happening.
paying for that testing?
Yeah.
So
That's the big question is,
the
who's
employee
pays for
has to
that?
pay for that. Yeah, it's not firm paid, and it's not paid by the state of New York. So, some people that have a more conservative mindset may see that as punitive to the employee. Again, it's about keeping the employee workforce safe. There was a lot of question for us that came around if they're remote and at home and not going into the client's office, then do they have to comply with that? And so the way our contract currently reads is if they are a 100% remote worker and are not going to be entering the client's office, then they do not have to comply. But if there's any chance that they are going to be traveling into the client's office, then yes, they would have to comply.
And that's the way the ETS is written too, that if you're remote 100% or you're outdoors, there's some provisions there. Yeah.
But yes, the employee is responsible for the cost of the test. So.
And that's still for only over 50 employees?
Well, that is contract
This was
specific.
just like internal for us at Horn based on a certain contract that we have in place.
The ETS was for 100 or more private employers, but there's also a healthcare and a government contractor or federal worker.
Contractor.
Yeah.
How does it work when most of the people in your office are independent?
If they're not your employee, the ETS
Very good question.
said specifically if they're actually an independent contractor, then that doesn't apply to them, correct?
For the CMS one, no.
No, the
But the
OSHA.
100, yes, yeah. I would caution you, though, to be very careful about who is classified as an independent contractor
That's a
versus
whole
who's.
nother.
Yep.
That's
can
a
of
whole
worms.
nother.
We need to
program.
have another source meeting on that.
Yeah, yeah.
Just say the word.
Yeah, because
How much oversight?
a
do
lot
you
of
have
people
over it?
like to classify the employees as a 1099 employee.
But they tell them when to be at work, how to do their
They manage
job,
their-
where to,
Provide all
yeah.
their
Correct.
materials.
Yes. So there's some questions there.
Yep, over here.
Maybe a dumb question, but does OSHA apply to really small organizations?
10 or more.
10 or more?
If you have 10 or more, OSHA says, do what we say.
Great questions.
I'm wondering about how Baker Donaldson created that
Child
Childcare leave.
Yeah.
suggestion. If some people work in an organization that they feel can really benefit from helping clean up sidewalks, cracking some new policies, what are some resources that y'all three use to help you come up with this? And
Well, probably one of the biggest go-tos is
That's
SHRM,
what I was
the
gonna say.
Society for Human Resource Management. That is kind of like our trade group, so to speak, in which we are members of, and there are local chapters to that. The Capital Area Human Resource Association is our big chapter here in Jackson. So SHRM really, they put a lot of money into lobbying the federal government for employer, issues. And so I lean on that organization very, very heavily, as well as in-house counsel, who is also leaning on that organization very heavily.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say also, if you work with an employee benefits broker, usually they have some great resources
Yes.
for you as well, which is where that's what we do. So
You can also look for magazines from Working Mothers. They will have articles in it. We have a pretty active women's initiative, and other firms do too. So you can kind of Google that and see if they've made any. Like we have a newsletter that would have information in there as well.
I would love to ask, for women who are here and they may be business owner or work for a small business, if they're sitting on zero and have no policy, no handbook, nothing already in writing, what's the best place for them to start?
Calling this lady right here,
One of us. So,
or that lady right there.
yeah. We're all pointing fingers. I do draft handbooks and review handbooks and all of that. But if you have employer services through your broker, start there first.
yeah, because they're free.
Yeah.
Usually they
They're
come with
free.
your business model. That's the way that we do things at Ross and Yerger. But I would just check.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would say too, SHRM.
Yeah.
SHRM is I would say if you are starting from zero and you are a business owner, or you work for a company and you've been voluntold that now you're going to do this, to create policies and create an HR department and all that good stuff. SHRM is a phenomenal investment because they are your human resource professionals. That's the
Yeah.
organization that will really direct you and give you solid best practice recommendations on steps to take. Really broken down into bite-sized chunks of what do I do next.
Like PDF templates and
Yes.
Word
Yeah.
documents that have the stuff in there, and all you do is fill in your name. I mean, I've used that before.
I mean, you pay for a
Um,
membership, but
you
it is
do.
such a phenomenal investment.
Yeah, there's a lot of free info, but and I would say there's probably many of you in the room today who have been forced into this world that maybe that this type of work doesn't normally fall into your scope. What you do, what you're supposed to be doing all day, every day. A great example of that, a girl that I used to work with years ago is the controller at First Presbyterian Church. They don't have an HR director at First Pres, and Haley, bless her heart, as the controller, is getting tasked with ensuring that they are in compliance. First Pres, believe it or not, has over 200 employees, full-time and part-time, when you think about the school, as well as their custodial staff and all the things that it takes to keep that campus running. She has no clue. She's a CPA. And so she's being asked to ensure compliance with a lot of this, and I've given her several avenues where she can start and kind of pushed her in the right direction. So if you find yourself in that category, please call one of us so we can at least kind of point you in the right direction and get you some help.
I mean, you will find a lot on Google, and it's, sometimes really good information. What I see a lot of times is you will get a policy from a public entity,
Yes.
whether
Right.
it's a university,
Right.
They're
a lot
so
of times,
easy.
and
Yeah.
for a private employer, there's going to be a lot of hoops you don't
Yeah.
have to jump through.
Right.
Yeah.
So just be mindful of that if you're Googling something online. Is this a private entity versus public entity? Because there will be some differences in the policies.
Questions?
Also something. When we were walking in downstairs, they asked me if I was looking for wealth management, and I said, I don't really have any wealth to manage. But this has been a wealth of information.
Thanks.
Thank
Thank you so much. And I was knee deep in my chicken salad when you said something about the Sixth Circuit in lottery. I thought that was hysterical, but
It is
is
very
that-
funny.
That's just so funny. But the question is it the Attorney General of Mississippi's case that you're talking about that we have filed with other states that we are trying to stop the mandates for Mississippi? Is that what that is?
It is all part of that.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't really know where Mississippi filed and what group, because they were groups that filed in
Right.
different states. But it is now all part of one big piece of litigation
So that
in
one
deal.
will be the very first one ruled on. We can, if we're not part of that one, we can pretty much see that that's going to be the answer to our question as well.
Right. So the cases will all get handled the same now. So let's say the Sixth Circuit agrees with the Fifth Circuit and rubber stamps it, ETS is done. Okay.
And that's
And then
is that
basically
what we
the-
want, girls? I mean, really, after listening today,
No
I'm like,
comments.
I've
It's-
heard so many people beg me for, do not make me take this shot.
It's-
Don't, that you're taking away
Yeah.
my
Constitutional
freedom, okay?
rights.
Then I hear you
Right.
say, ultimately, it's going to trickle down to the businesses, and it's going to trickle back into our pocketbooks.
Right.
When then it's going to be,
Right.
I didn't know that it was going to cost
Right.
me, and I was going to lose my job.
Right. That's a great question that I don't think, again, back to uncertainty, I don't think any of us really know, because I think that no matter the way that it shakes out, both come to the table with an
Right.
equal balance of both good and bad. You have to think for vaccine mandates for individuals that can't take it, that they have had a physician say to them, do not do this. What are they going to do? And so you have a lot of those individuals that fall into that bucket. But then you also have employer interests that want to keep the doors open and want to keep their people safe. And they feel very strongly that vaccines are the way to go, that it's really hard to say one way or another, because we've had multiple conversations with clients that we've walked through those scenarios of it being a very, very bad thing, but then also organizations that it would be a very, very good thing. So it's truly one of those, which
Yeah.
way do you go? And we'll just have to see. Was that the right?
That's the right answer. Also, as an employer, knowing where you are on the vaccination status of your
Yeah.
employees. So,
And that's a very good point we didn't talk about
Yeah.
earlier. We have done, amongst some of our work groups, have done a voluntary kind of survey just to test the pulse.
That's a
and
great
see
idea.
Where are we? It was voluntary. You didn't have to tell us whether you were or weren't. There were no personal identifiers. It was strictly a yes or no question, and it was just a number. Yeah, we have this many total employees, this many. I mean, there was just one question on the Survey Monkey. People get freaked out about surveys because they think we're going to be able to tell who I am. And so we just kind of did that with a couple of groups of our employees to just get a pulse.
Yeah.
And
the
see.
concerns I've had are I'm having employees quit. I'm not having anybody to work. And then I've also had other employers say, well, my employees say they'll get it if I make them get it.
Right.
Right.
But otherwise they're not going to take it.
Right.
So,
Yeah. We'll see.
Good questions.
I wish I had a better answer for you.
Thank y'all so much. This was so incredible, and y'all said a lot of acronyms that I probably don't know.
Vegetable soup.
That's right. But if these ladies want to reach out to any of y'all, how would they do that?
Yes. Go ahead.
call me. I've got business cards.
Okay.
I am K Smith at Ross and all spelled out Yerger.com. YERGER. A lot of
Yeah.
people have a hard time with that one. Or you can just ask me, just come up to me and I'll tell you again.
Yeah, I've got cards, our information, my contact information's on our website, but feel free to ask me for anything specific, cell phone. You can pretty much get me anytime.